On the line with us right now is Katrina Vanden Heuvel. She is the editor, publisher of The Nation. She writes a weekly web column for The Washington Post. Good morning, Katrina.
Good morning. How are you?
Great. It's great to have you back on the show. I looked it up. It's been 9 years. Wow.
Well, 9 years, flies by when there's been so little news and things are calm and secure and well in our great nation and the world.
You know what I love is your lack of sarcasm. It's so refreshing.
Listen. The nation was founded nearly 150 years ago, 1865. The first line of the first issue, the editors, in their wisdom, wrote, "The week has been singularly barren of exciting events." I have not spent a single week at the Nation when such has occurred.
So, it's been far too long, and now that I have all of your email addresses, I'm going to be really harassing you in the future to come back on the show, so I apologize for that.
Good.
So, like those of us who were against the invasion and occupation of Iraq, who were called Saddam apologists, we're now Putin supporters for questioning the Russia is evil and the West is good narrative. In that storyline, there is no gray, and the analysis is simplistic, cheerleading. So as I asked during the run-up to the invasion and occupation of Iraq, what do you disapprove of when it comes to Putin's actions in Ukraine? We'll get to the West later, but for now, what's wrong with what Putin's doing? Because anytime, when I had Kathy Kelly on the show over and over again from Voice in the Wilderness, and she was breaking sanctions, people were saying, oh, you're somebody who supports Saddam Hussein. She would refuse to speak to anybody from the Hussein government, and she was always speaking out against the human rights abuses of Saddam Hussein. So what is wrong that Putin is doing so people understand that you nor I are Putin apologists?
Well, first of all, let me step back and just say that I think it's a terrible you spoke of the Iraq War. The first casualty of war is often truth.
Right.
The first casualty of this Ukrainian crisis has been complexity and history. And I think it's a measure of the failure of a great representative democracy to have a very serious debate. The political and media establishment of this country has failed us. No one is sitting here justifying Putin's actions, but the failure to see complexity and instead have a media give us a black hat, white hat narrative is not helpful to resolving a crisis. Unless we want to go to war, and I don't believe Ukraine is in the United States' national security interest, and I don't believe anyone in Washington, with all the posturing, even John McCain, who seems to want to go to war with every country he can cite on a map, no one is talking about war. Putin, I think with the Crimea, we saw a violation of international law in the annexation of Crimea. Mm-hmm. There is a history there. The former Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine. Russia gave Crimea to Ukraine, I believe, in 1954. It was a kind of birthday present administrative move on the part of Khrushchev. Still, it was a violation in annexing Crimea, a violation of international law. I think Putin has also at home, and this is going to get worse if we see more war saber rattling. Anytime that goes on, as you know, it empowers the worst elements in all countries, and we're going to see more crackdown on independent media, more crackdown on civil society, and more repressive laws inside Russia. So these are elements of Putin's Russia. But I will say one thing that is not helpful. One needs to understand Russia's policies. That doesn't mean justifying them. But if one doesn't understand why Russia, under the Putin, is angered by the expansion of NATO in these last decades, one cannot understand the history and the complexity of what we're witnessing in Ukraine. Your listeners should know, that after the fall of the Berlin Wall 23 years ago, Gorbachev, then the Soviet leader, was promised by George H.W. Bush, Jim Baker, etc., that NATO, which is a military institution, it's not a Tea Party, so Tea Party has a different connotation now, I guess.
Right.
It is a military institution, that it would not move 1 inch eastward. It's now, NATO now is 9 Central European countries, the Baltics, there's movement in Georgia. That was the red line. So, someone I'm not sure I admire, I bet many of your listeners don't, I thought put it well Henry Kissinger wrote about 2 months ago that demonizing Putin is not a policy. It's an alibi for not having a policy. And people can rail as they should. There should be protest inside Russia against Putin's crackdown on various elements, but it's not a policy just to demonize. We're not going to get very far.
Wow, so Kissinger was right, like my broken watch twice a day. Hey, so Putin, one of the things that people are saying about the reason that the Russians are having their policy in Ukraine is this. This is the simplistic way that it's being discussed. And I know you were just saying how it's a real shame that we're not having more of a complex discussion when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. But the only logic that I have heard, doesn't matter if it's CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, it doesn't matter, MSNBC, it doesn't matter. It's because what Putin really wants to do is he wants to bring back the old Russian Empire. What does that do to our discussion on Ukraine when everybody's telling us the only thing that Putin is trying to do is rebuild the empire of Catherine the Great or whoever?
This misunderstanding leads to, again, a narrative that fails us in crafting a policy that makes any sense for our own interests, for regional interests. You know, it goes back to 2007. You were talking earlier about the Iraq War.
Right.
There was a Munich Security Conference. I believe it was 2007, might have been 2006, but those were certainly years of the Iraq War, where Putin spoke. McCain was there. There were all these poobahs. And he spoke about the importance of not having a unilateral world because, you know, the United States was throwing its weight around. There's a belief that it's the indispensable nation, this and that. And he stood up and said, no, we need policies that are going to be, you know, regional partnerships. So there was great anger at Putin for standing up, not as an imperial force, but just standing up for Russia as a force in the world. And it was down on its knees in those times. One of the great failures, and again, history here, at the end of the Cold War, those who were involved in ending the Cold War, including Reagan's ambassador to Russia, Jack Matlock, said it was a great failure that there was this triumphalism at the end of the Cold War, as if the United States had won the Cold War. No one won the Cold War. Right. It was a negotiated settlement. There were no victors. And so I think you have that resentment, those grievances. I think Crimea, as we spoke about, yes, a violation of international law, led many in the West to jump illogically to the belief that Putin was trying to recreate the Soviet empire. There is a confederation structure that Putin has advocated. That is not an empire. Nor is there, and never say never, but nor is there much evidence that Russia has wanted to take over eastern or southern Ukraine. The costs of occupation would be horrific. And most in those regions just seek more autonomy, more federalization, not unification with Russia. So there is a deep misunderstanding, and I think it serves U.S. European policies, not all European, but U.S. policies well to attribute this imperial thrust to Putin, which is not laid out in the evidence.
We are speaking with Katrina Vanden Heuvel. She is the editor and publisher of The Nation. She writes a weekly web column for The Washington Post. This week's was headlined, Ukraine Needs Russia and the West. Her blog, Editor's Cut, appears at thenation.com. Her most recent book is 2011's The Change I Believe In, Fighting for Progress in the Age of Obama. You can get that book at Nation Books or just go to our website and click on the title, and it takes you directly to Nation Books where you can purchase that book. One contentious point about the changeover in government in Kiev is whether it was a coup or not. I realize that the United States has a law that does not allow for the U.S. to fund coup governments, and that's one of the reasons that discussion is taking place. But we've had, you're now the fourth guest of ours to be discussing Ukraine. We've had guests who said that this was a coup because the handover of power did not follow Ukraine's constitution. A deal was made between the Yanukovych government and those who were protesting and challenging his power. But once Yanukovych fled Ukraine, or as his opponents would say abandon Ukraine. The agreement was torn up. That's when the new government took power. Another guest argued that this is not a coup because the party that took power was not the one that was behind the protests in the street, and that party actually at points spoke out against the coup. So is this a coup, and could it have been anything but a coup once Yanukovych fled? After all, didn't that eliminate any chance of any handover of power that might follow Ukraine's constitution?
You know, the Ukraine crisis did not need to be a crisis. Let's go back a little bit before the alleged coup.
Okay.
In November, the EU basically threw down the gauntlet and said, Ukraine joins EU or the highway. There was a tripartite agreement on the table. Putin had put it out that the Ukraine remain part of both East and West. And the Ukraine needs to be part of both East and West if it's going to emerge as a stable, semi-prosperous, democratic country. It has had long ties with Russia, and just economically, I think some 60% of its trading is with Russia and natural gas and all. There is the case that the West jettisoned in February its own agreement. It was an agreement, I believe, with the Polish foreign minister, 2 other European foreign ministers, that had been worked out with then-President Viktor Yanukovych. When he fled, that agreement was thrown into the streets, and the streets played a role in throwing it into the streets, and it brought to power in Kiev an unelected regime. It was unelected. Many argue it is illegitimate. It was created out of violent protests and in violation of this negotiated agreement for a peaceful transition. So call it what you will. It was uncritically embraced by Washington. The unelected regime raised serious alarms in parts of the country, eastern, southern, because one of its first acts, though it then stepped back and repealed it, was to outlaw Russia as a second language of Ukraine. And that, as you can imagine, as that news spread, it was then repealed a few days later, but as that news spread, the minority, eastern, southern Ukraine, felt very alienated from a Kiev government, which had done that. So there, one step back again, history, there are extraordinarily deep divisions in Ukraine. And if those are going to be exacerbated by these kinds of policies, it will be harder to have a united and functional Ukraine. So I think there was a kind of... So looking ahead, what we're looking at, it's very hard to believe that there's supposed to be elections on May 25th, right? It's it's like tomorrow. There have been multi-party dialogues led by the Germans in these last days. Unfortunately, Eastern Ukrainian representatives have not been present in any serious way. Will these elections be fair and representative? Will they be respected by those parts of the country which feel alienated from the Kiev government in the West? Hard to know. There are threats from the U.S. and European governments that if the elections do not happen and are not abided by, that deeper sanctions will be applied. The hope is whoever is elected would understand the need for both constitutional changes and parliamentary elections, which are not included May 25th.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up sanctions. Last week we were talking to Thanasis Kambanis. He is a writer who writes for Al Jazeera, writes for a whole bunch of different places. He was talking to us live from Beirut. He's been doing a lot of reporting on the Syrian war, and he's been posted for a good deal of that time on the Turkish-Syrian border. He was reporting to us from Beirut, and I was just thinking he was talking about democracy promotion, and one thing that he was saying about democracy promotion is one of the ways to undermine it is to have economic sanctions against a people. He was saying that, for instance, the economic sanctions against Iran, which he even, said that, well, maybe those might work out. Who knows in the long run? But he was saying that this is just another example of economic sanctions hurting the people where the democracy promotion might actually work the most. So how effective are these sanctions, the economic sanctions we're putting against Ukraine, in delivering reform and democracy, or do they undermine the very people who might bring about that democracy?
It's a very important question. There have been attempts in these last years to develop what are called smart sanctions, which affect a limited group, the elites in different countries, military elements. So far, the sanctions against Russia have been limited. They've been applied to people around Putin, to oligarchs, to banking interests, minor, individual, not sectoral. I think you're the person you were talking to who spoke of what the impact in Syria or Iran. I'm not sure it would apply to Russia unless they did begin to move to impose sectoral ones, banking, mining, financial. I think the deeper question here is these sanctions will push Russia toward China, which has already been a major ally in economic and political ways. There will be a coalition. There will be East versus West. And I think more important is that we look at Ukraine. You know, your listeners may not know, but what we are witnessing at the moment in eastern Ukraine is what I would call the oligarchization of politics. The reason there is now more quiet in eastern Ukraine, and that is good, that there are no roaming bands and the militants, is because the chief oligarch of the Donbass region has deployed his workers. He has about 300,000 workers in mining and other factories into the streets to bring calm and stability. Rinat Akhmetov. I point that out just because as we talk about the economics of this region, we know that oligarchs have looted and plundered Russia in these last decades. There's been some stabilization of that. Ukraine has been looted and plundered on a smaller scale, perhaps even more deeply. But what is sad is that those who protested in the square of Maidan were protesting for a number of reasons, but central was a protest against kleptocracy, oligarchical economics, corruption. And I think what we're witnessing now is the resurgence and re-strengthening of an oligarchical class that will have its way in order to stabilize Ukraine. And this is both East, West. The leading candidates for the May 25th election are both oligarchs. One is a chocolate oligarch. The other is called a gas princess, Yulia Tymoshenko. Yeah. And so what happens to ordinary people, whether it's via sanctions and the impact on them, which is not fully clear vis-a-vis Russia, but what happens to ordinary people in Ukraine is that we may see, again, a shafting of people whose interests will be subservient to the oligarchs, and made worse, if I could add, by the International Monetary Fund's presence in Kiev. It agreed to give $17 billion over 2 years. This was last week. It's not clear in which form, loans, etc. But we know what the IMF has done in various countries over these last decades, and we will likely see slash pensions, the end of subsidies for heating, for other benefits that will help the elites, perhaps, and shaft ordinary people.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the oligarch and how he was sending hundreds of thousands of his workers into the street to bring about stability, because yesterday on ABC World News with Diane Sawyer, she reported that story as if this is the most wonderful thing that can happen. Look, the people of Ukraine are rising up, and it's because of a businessman who sent out his steel workers to bring stability to the area. And I watch ABC, NBC, CBS News every night simultaneously on 3 different monitors. I tweet during the news, and it nauseates me what I see every night. But then when I see this.
Think of it. I mean, essentially what you're witnessing, this has been the history, by the way, in these parts of Ukraine, and certainly in Russia, too, where you've had oligarchs run company towns. They've bought up the factories. They've bought up the precious minerals, gas. But you essentially deconstruct what Diane Sawyer, give it another look, give it a different narrative. You have an oligarch who may have told his superintendents, tell the workers if they want their jobs and their wages, get into the streets. Let's take back this region. And so, it's interesting. Miners have played a major role in many protests in the post-Soviet period. And we'll see how miners play out. But, I have a Russian friend named Boris Kagarlitsky, very interesting, runs the Institute for Social Movements and Globalization in Moscow. And he wrote just a week ago about what's happening in southern Ukraine, the Donetsk Republic, the importance possibly of growing the social base of the uprising there, not in a militant way, but growing a social base to serve people. And he put forward, he said there should be an anti-oligarch social program. Such a program, he wrote, doesn't even have to be exclusively left-wing or socialist. It's enough to call for nationalization of the property of those Ukrainian oligarchs and to demand that these assets be directed toward the solving of social problems, investment in healthcare, education, and the development of infrastructure. I raise that, my friend, as someone who has been a decent, humane person over these years, but think how far we are from that in Ukraine right now.
Yeah. You write, U.S. actions over the past several months have defied common sense. Given the deep divisions in Ukrainian society and the vital interest Russia has in the country, it was a provocative step for the United States to immediately and unconditionally recognize as legitimate the government erected out of violent protests and in violation of the negotiated settlement for peaceful transition. And it makes no sense to treat Russia's actions as an existential threat to the post-war international order, given that the West needs Russian cooperation to stabilize Ukraine both politically and financially. So let me play devil's advocate for a second. This policy completely makes sense to me. The U.S. is simply backing as fast as possible the Ukrainian government so U.S. corporations can make money off of Ukrainians and can lend them all sorts of money to make them indebted to the U.S. Treating Russia as an existential threat leads to more potential spending on the military here in the States, creates an exaggerated threat that continues to support the national security policy of the U.S., which, as Tufts Professor Michael J. Glennon pointed out on our show, is the double government of the U.S. That is, the national security policy is bipartisan and never changes. So doesn't the U.S. policy in Ukraine make sense when you consider how cynical U.S. policy is? Doesn't it make sense within this framework of how the U.S. expresses power overseas?
You know, let me step back and say I agree with you that in these conflicts, the war parties get fat, get rich, want to see more of this. But at the moment, we're looking at some money going to NATO, which has eaten up a lot of money. And also, it's a sucker's game. You know, they bring these countries in and then force them to buy Western military equipment. I think the military-industrial complex is bloated. It is being reduced. I think the surveillance state is obscenely overextended, abusing our privacy and not necessarily being very effective. But if you think about what common sense might mean, and if there's some sane people, and I think there's some sane people in the military and the government, you know, we need to resolve, we need to engage with Iran if we're going to see stability in the Middle East and more generally halt some elements of, you know, nuclear proliferation. We need to find a resolution to the horrific conflict in Syria, and both of those issues are central to engaging Russia. You cannot resolve those without Russia. So in alienating Russia, we are undermining our national security, the collateral damage of resolving those crises. In addition, we might well see a new arms race. Not clear to me if that's common sense. And, you know, Ukraine is not in our national security interest. It is, we have elevated, and the EU is also complicit in this. Let us not forget the EU, which in many ways instigated this. The U.S. then got drawn in, played a key role, and it's now proxy Russia-U.S. conflict here. But this was a deeply domestic issue. It's a divided country. We're witnessing a civil war. This is not an existential threat to the international security architecture of the world. So I think this misadventure, like so many others, doesn't have the benefits you described. There's not much, by the way. You know, these oligarchs in Ukraine have already looted a lot.
Right.
I think what we're going to see, the other collateral damage, I'll end here, is that you might see waves of Ukrainian migrant workers pouring into Europe. We haven't even talked about Europe. Last I checked, tell me if I'm wrong, you got Greece, which is falling and failing. Spain's on the verge of economic crisis, 40% unemployed among young people in some of these countries. Europe is not in great shape. It's now going to take on a country where you might see, as I said, unemployed people pouring into these countries. That's not going to be happy. It'll probably strengthen the right wing, which we see resurgent in parts of not only Eastern but Western Europe.
Back in December, we were speaking with Andrew Coburn because he had an article out in Harper's Magazine about how domestic politics so drives foreign policy. So he was arguing that the United States doesn't have a foreign policy. Well, we have a domestic policy that drives that foreign policy. And I was thinking about how much maybe this dilemma with the situation in Ukraine is about the domestic politics, not just here in the United States, but also in Russia, not just in the West, too. I want to also, as you were saying, incorporate EU. This is about domestic politics and not about what's happening within Ukraine. How much are outsiders like the West and Russia, how much are the domestic political situations within the West and Russia undermining any obstacle for the Ukrainians to find stability, to find reform, and to find democracy?
Let me just speak about Russia briefly. I mean, I think you have you're witnessing a resurgence of nationalism, of jingoism, of patriotism, all of these around the Ukrainian crisis. There is a view that Putin is a weak leader and needs these foreign misadventures to strengthen himself. There's another view that this was not something Putin or the Russian government wanted. Sochi was still underway when this started, and they have other things on their mind. They are, as I said, developing alliances with China. They're trying to stabilize an economy, diversify an economy. I think, of course, there are always domestic pressures, domestic considerations that go into foreign policy. My view about the U.S. is that you have neocon elements still not only in Congress and in a political elite, but, there was a woman, Victoria Nuland, some of your listeners may remember, who played a key role in this notorious leaked phone conversation in February,
right,
indicating very clearly that she and her U.S. colleagues on the ground were doing everything to drive the situation in a way that was certain to provoke a costly crisis with Russia. What's interesting to me about her is why is a neoconservative like Victoria Nuland in the Obama State Department? I mean, it turns out she was a Hillary Clinton appointee whom Obama could not or would not remove. So I think we're seeing, elements, vestiges, still very strong of a failed foreign policy stance, the neocon foreign policy stance, that have played a role. But there's no question that we see domestic factors playing out that have nothing to do really with Ukraine. The one thing I'd come back to is I do think there are oligarchs in Russia and Ukrainian oligarchs who have ties with Russia who don't want to see things get out of control. And that plays a role. On a very human level, my husband, Stephen Cohen, and I have been going to Moscow together for 30 years. He's been going for longer. Ukraine is the country where almost every Russian we know has a relative, a mother-in-law, there's intermarriage. There's a very tight, woven historical connection to Ukraine that you don't have with any other former republic in the former Soviet Union. And I think those domestic considerations on a human level have to play a role.
Yeah, and I'm afraid of trying to make this a story about the United States or the West or a story about Russia and ignoring the story that's happening within Ukraine, as you've been pointing out. The story of the oligarchs is missed when we see this as an issue the way it's being framed, Obama being weak or Putin acting like some sort of invading dictator. Now, how important, though, was the role of the NED, of USAID in toppling that Yanukovych government? Because even though I don't want to make this about Russia and the United States, I want this to be about Ukraine. I'd like to know to what degree the NED and USAID, what role they played. How significant was their role in the Yanukovych government collapsing?
Okay, I haven't done enough reporting on it. There are people who've done some reporting. Again, history. Let's not forget the Orange Revolution. Was it 2004? The Orange Revolution was a precursor to this, where people slept in the square in Kiev, where John McCain and Richard Holbrooke of the United States, people were flying in to show solidarity with protesters,
right,
overturning the then Ukrainian government. At that moment, it was clearly there was Western money coming in. I never believe, and this, again, I take issue with Putin/Russian government, which alleges, protesters in the street are funded by Hillary Clinton. This is nonsense. There are indigenous forces, there are indigenous groups which organize and protest and rise up to, take back their country from oligarchs who are now back in their country. But I think USAID, we saw this in Cuba recently. If your listeners remember, there was a whole Twitter program set up to not necessarily inform the good Cuban people, but it looked to be another destabilization program. I think there's been money floating around, sloshing around, not only in Ukraine, but in former Soviet republics in Central Europe. And some of it's benign. Some of it is to set up citizen-to-citizen exchange. Some of it is not. Some of it is really supporting groups which want to destabilize. The sadness is that these groups could work on their own, and by the U.S. money does taint and stigmatize as it comes out in WikiLeaks or in leaked tapes. I think we would do well, the United States, and I'm not an isolationist, but we would do very well to get our own house in order and stop roaming the world trying to bring democracy promotion to others. I'm not a fan of democracy promotion. I think they're civil society programs, but when the government gets involved, I think it gets dicey.
Yeah, what Thanasis was saying on the show last week, that if instead of focusing on the type of democracy promotion now that we do now, and we focused on education, the economy of these nations and funding that, and their health care, you'd be setting up a much better system for promoting democracy within that country than just giving money to the side that you think is more democratic than the other.
Yeah, I think you give money exactly to development, to building an infrastructure in these countries so that there is a process by which these groups can work more effectively, that there are institutions which are strong. Because so often this money comes in at the top, it goes to deeply political ends, and the Orange Revolution, let us remember, you did have money sloshing around, you had Western forces coming in to support. It was upended by its own dead weight. I mean, the corruption and other forces didn't permit that moment to go forward in a positive way. So then you had Yanukovych, you had additional corruption, and now you have this moment. And I want to be hopeful about a Ukraine that can be part of both East and West, and that there's prosperity for all, and some form of its own democracy. But it's not being birthed in a way that gives one great hope.
One last question for you, Katrina. We've been speaking with Katrina Vanden Heuvel. She is the editor and publisher of The Nation. Katrina writes a weekly web column for The Washington Post. This week's was headlined, Ukraine Needs Russia and the West. Her blog, Editor's Cut, appears at thenation.com. Katrina's most recent book is 2011's The Change I Believe In, Fighting for Progress in the Age of Obama. You go to our website, you click on Katrina's name, it takes you directly to her columns at The Nation, and there's also a link there to her most recent book. Again, The Change I Believe In, Fighting for Progress in the Age of Obama, and that book came out in 2011. One last question for you, Katrina, and it's what we call the question from hell, the question we hate to ask. You might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate the response. So, again, your piece at the Washington Post this week, Ukraine needs Russia and the West. So why not judge a book by a cover, or judge your entire work by a headline that you didn't write? Because clearly towards the end of that column, you don't necessarily perfectly agree with that phrase, Ukraine needs Russia and the West. What would you say to those that would argue that Ukraine does not need Russia or the West, that all their problems are because Russia and the West are screwing with Ukraine, and that Ukraine needs less interference from Russia and the West and more self-determination?
I begin with the idea that, of course, Ukraine needs more self-determination. But all countries are dependent on others in different ways. My point here is that it was a mistake to make this distinction that Ukraine joined the West through the EU, or that it remain in partnership in some way with Russia. It makes no sense, as I write, to treat Russia's actions as an existential threat to the post-war international order, given that the West needs Russian cooperation to stabilize Ukraine, both politically and financially. Ukraine needs trading partners. Ukraine needs investment. Ukraine needs engagement with West and East. But to treat it as this civilizational struggle or existential struggle will not benefit Ukraine. Sovereignty, Self-determination, yes, but after those steps, you can't live in isolation. This is, don't love the world, but, we do live in a globalized world, an interdependent world. I seek fair globalization, not corporate globalization, and I seek an interdependence that favors self-determination. But no country in this moment, in this time, can be on its own. That's a kind of autarkic throwback to a time which is no longer possible, it seems to me. How people engage with that country with respect and dignity, and Ukraine with other countries, is at the heart of the matter.
Katrina, it's great to have you back on this show. I've been in email contact with this gentleman who has some sort of relationship with you by the name of Stephen Cohen.
Get him on. I'll tell him to come on.
Thank you very much, Katrina. It's a pleasure to hear your voice again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And I'll be bugging you in the future.
Leave it to another 9 years. Okay.
No. Take care. Bye.